At 24, Eliza Ward had almost nothing left. Her father was dead, sewing work had dried up, and the last room she could afford in the Colorado mountain settlement of Silver Hollow was being given to someone who could actually pay the rent. Winter was already whitening the peaks, and with nowhere else to sleep, Eliza made the strangest decision anyone in town could imagine. She packed everything she owned into a few bundles and moved into Blackstone, an abandoned silver mine outside town where her father had once worked. People laughed when they saw her carrying blankets and salvaged boards toward the dark entrance. Some began calling her the Mine Girl. Amos Pike joked that if the Ward family had fallen any further, Eliza would have to dig herself out. Even those who pitied her thought she had finally become desperate enough to lose good sense. An abandoned mine could collapse, flood, fill with bad air, or become a frozen grave. But Eliza knew one thing the people laughing at her did not. Before her father Daniel died, he had repeatedly given her one strange warning. Never let them seal Blackstone completely. She had always believed those words came from an old miner who could not let go of the place where he had spent most of his life. Then, while turning the mine's entrance chamber into a crude home, Eliza discovered her father's symbol carved into the stone. Behind it, she found reinforced timbers where no valuable ore remained, a ventilation opening that was still drawing fresh air, and an old drainage channel that appeared to have been maintained long after Blackstone stopped producing silver. Deeper in Daniel's notebook were markings for chambers he considered safe, repeated references to winter, and two words Eliza had never heard him explain: upper refuge. Something about Blackstone did not fit the story Silver Hollow remembered. Then the snow began. The first storm closed the wagon road. The second damaged roofs and cut the town off from supplies. Temperatures plunged. Firewood became harder to move, and suddenly the people who had laughed at Eliza for living underground began appearing at the entrance of Blackstone looking for shelter. But when the mine filled with frightened families, Eliza discovered evidence that her father had known this day might come. Hidden among the old workings was a forgotten record from an earlier winter, and what it revealed about why Blackstone had never been meant to remain just an abandoned mine would change the way Silver Hollow remembered Daniel Ward and the poor young woman they had mocked for moving into the mountain. But before we uncover what Eliza's father knew, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now, whether you're starting your morning, relaxing in the afternoon, or listening late at night. I hope you're having a wonderful day. And if you enjoy emotional frontier stories about ordinary people, survival, forgotten history, and discoveries that change everything, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Now, let's return to Silver Hollow in the late autumn of 1881, when Eliza Ward carried everything she owned toward an abandoned mine, while the people behind her laughed. Margaret Bell waited until breakfast was over before asking Eliza Ward to remain in the boarding house kitchen. That kindness made the conversation worse. "I can give you until tomorrow," Margaret said quietly, "but the room has to go to someone who can pay." Eliza looked at the worn floorboards rather than at her. At 24, she owned little enough that losing one rented room should not have felt like losing a home. Yet it did. Sewing work had fallen off as winter approached, and the few washing and mending jobs she found barely covered food. "I understand." Margaret lowered her voice. "You could stay another week. We could work something out." "No. Eliza, you run a boarding house, not a charity." Margaret's expression tightened, but she did not argue. By noon, Eliza had packed her clothes, sewing things, 2 blankets, Daniel's old notebook, a cooking pot, and the few possessions worth carrying. Snow already dusted the high slopes above Silver Hollow. Finding another affordable room before winter was unlikely. She had spent the previous night considering one place nobody else wanted. Blackstone Mine lay outside town, Abandoned after the Silvers stopped paying enough to justify the work, Daniel Ward had labored there for years before an injury ended his mining life. When Eliza was younger, he had taken her as far as the entrance chamber and taught her never to wander underground. He had also said something she remembered now with inconvenient clarity. That first chamber's safer than half the buildings in Silver Hollow, if you know where to stop. Eliza loaded her belongings onto a small handcart and started toward the edge of town. People noticed. By the time she passed Amos Pike's general store, 2 men outside had stopped talking. Amos stepped into the doorway. "Where are you headed with your whole household, Miss Ward?" "Blackstone." One of the men laughed. Amos stared at her. "The mine, the entrance chamber. You're planning to live underground? I'm planning to live somewhere I don't owe rent." Another laugh followed. Eliza kept walking before her face could betray how deeply it landed. Behind her, Amos said something about the Ward girl becoming a miner after all. She heard enough to know the joke would travel through Silver Hollow faster than she could pull the cart. Near the last buildings, a man stepped from beside a stack of lumber. Thomas Hale watched the cart, then looked toward the mountain road. "Tell me Amos misunderstood." He didn't. Thomas was 31, a carpenter who repaired almost everything in Silver Hollow eventually. Unlike the men outside the store, he did not smile. "Abandoned mines aren't empty rooms, Eliza. Timber rots, rock shifts, air goes bad." "I know." "Do you?" She stopped pulling. "My father showed me the entrance workings. I'm not going deeper." Thomas studied her for a moment. Daniel knew Blackstone better than most. He said the first chamber was stable years ago. "It's the place I have—" Thomas glanced back toward town. "Margaret put you out? Margaret needs paying customers. I could help you find. I don't need another person finding somewhere to keep me." Her answer came sharper than intended. Thomas nodded once. "All right. But let me look at the chamber before you sleep there." "Why?" "Because being poor isn't a good reason to have a roof fall on you." Eliza almost refused, simply because accepting help felt too close to accepting pity. Then she looked toward Blackstone and remembered that stubbornness would not hold stone overhead. "You can look tomorrow." Thomas accepted that. Eliza continued alone. Blackstone's entrance opened darkly from the mountainside, surrounded by weathered timber and old tailings. Inside, the first chamber smelled of cold stone and dust. Her footsteps echoed as she set down the blankets. The place was bleak, but dry. The ceiling supports appeared heavy, and the chamber was protected from the wind outside. Daniel had been right about that much. Eliza sat on her bundled blanket and listened to the silence. Hours earlier, she had lived among people who knew her name. Now those same people were probably laughing about the poor Ward girl sleeping in a mine. She let herself feel the humiliation for only a moment before standing. If Blackstone was what she had, she would make it livable. She began inspecting the walls the way Daniel had once taught her, looking for cracks, dampness, and loose stone. Near the back of the entrance chamber, beneath years of grime, she noticed a shallow carving. Eliza wiped it with her sleeve and froze. 2 angled lines crossed by a short horizontal mark. She knew that symbol. Daniel had used it when showing her places underground he considered safe, but she had never known he had carved it here. Eliza's first night in Blackstone was colder than she had expected. The entrance chamber blocked the mountain wind, but cold rose through the stone floor until both blankets seemed too thin. She slept in her coat and woke repeatedly to unfamiliar sounds settling timber. Water dripping somewhere beyond the chamber, the faint movement of air through darkness. By morning, pride had become less important than making the place practical. She carried in discarded boards for a raised sleeping platform, arranged her cooking pot and sewing things near the wall, and cleared loose debris from the entrance. A small iron stove she had bought cheaply months earlier became the center of the room. Though her limited fuel meant she could not keep it burning constantly, near midday, Ben Carter appeared carrying 2 boards across his shoulder. The 16-year-old stable boy set them down without ceremony. These were behind the stable. Nobody wants them. Eliza eyed him. Did Thomas send you? No. Margaret? No. Ben shrugged. Your father fixed a harness buckle for me once and wouldn't take anything for it. Figured I could carry boards. That explanation allowed Eliza to accept them. Together they raised her bedding several inches above the cold floor. Ben asked no questions about why she lived there, which made his company easier than sympathy would have. Thomas arrived later with a lantern and a carpenter's hammer. You said tomorrow. I remember. Eliza watched as he inspected the entrance supports, tapping timber, studying the ceiling, and checking cracks along the rock. He moved carefully rather than pretending certainty. Finally, he lowered the lantern. I wouldn't call any abandoned mine safe, but these entrance timbers are heavier than I expected, and the chamber looks unusually well supported. Eliza glanced at Daniel's carved symbol. My father knew. Thomas followed her gaze. She explained the mark Daniel had taught her simple signs when she was a girl, safe places, unstable ground, passages never to enter. Thomas crouched beside the carving. Then pay attention to everyone you find. They moved only to the rear edge of the chamber. There, Eliza discovered another faint mark near a narrow side passage. She rubbed away dust until 3 short cuts became visible. Her stomach tightened. That means don't enter. Thomas immediately stepped back. Then we don't. A second mark farther along pointed toward another passage. This one with Daniel's safer symbol. Eliza stared into it, but did not follow. She remembered his hand on her shoulder years earlier, stopping her whenever curiosity carried her too close to darkness. Never guess underground. Ellie, guessing gets people buried. Thomas left before evening, after helping her adjust the stove so its pipe ran more securely toward the entrance. You'll need more fuel, he said. I know. And don't explore alone. I'm not exploring. His glance toward the symbols made clear he did not believe her completely. After he left, Eliza opened Daniel's notebook beside the stove. Most pages contained ordinary observations from his working years. Timber repairs, water levels, names of men, dates she barely remembered. She found sketches resembling the marks on the walls, but no explanation for why he had marked an abandoned section so carefully. One memory kept returning instead. Near the end of his life, Daniel had heard men discussing whether Blackstone's entrance should be sealed to keep children and drifters out. His reaction had been immediate. Never let them seal Blackstone completely. Eliza had thought he was clinging to the mine because injury had taken it from him before he was ready. Sitting inside it now, she wondered whether she had misunderstood. The next morning brought sharper cold. Eliza rationed the stove and searched the chamber for drafts. Holding her hand near the wall, she felt a faint current of air coming through an old opening above shoulder height. She lifted the lantern. The narrow ventilation opening had been framed deliberately, and despite years of abandonment, it still drew fresh air. That made the chamber more usable, but it raised another question. Why maintain ventilation in a part of a mine no one was supposed to use? Eliza followed the wall beneath it and noticed a shallow groove cut into the floor. At first, she mistook it for erosion. Then she cleared dirt with a scrap of board. The groove continued along the chamber edge and disappeared toward the entrance. A little water moved through it instead of spreading across the floor. It was a drainage channel. Eliza traced it backward and found sections cleared of rubble, the stone edges showing signs of deliberate repair. Daniel's notebook contained several brief entries about drainage near Blackstone's upper workings, including dates years after productive work there had declined. Eliza sat back on her heels. Miners maintained passages while they were useful. They did not usually keep repairing abandoned ground for nothing. Yet someone, possibly her father, had kept this chamber ventilated and dry long after the silver stopped mattering. She looked from the drainage channel to Daniel's safe mark on the wall. For the first time, Blackstone felt less like the desperate shelter she had chosen, and more like a place her father had expected someone to use. By the following afternoon, Eliza had read Daniel's notebook from beginning to end twice. Most of it remained stubbornly ordinary. He had recorded timber replacements, water seepage, damaged tools, and names of miners who owed one another shifts. But several pages near the back contained the same symbols she had found inside Blackstone's entrance chamber. Beside 3 of them, Daniel had written a single word: winter. Eliza was studying those entries when Thomas appeared carrying a lantern and a coil of rope. "You're planning to go farther in," he said. "I was planning to look at the passage marked safe." "That's what I said. I didn't ask for company." "Good. Then you won't owe me for it." Eliza frowned, but Thomas was already checking his lantern. She could have ordered him out. Instead, she took Daniel's notebook and led him to the rear of the entrance chamber. They passed the side opening marked with Daniel's warning symbol without entering it. Beyond, the safer passage narrowed before opening into another chamber. Eliza stopped at its threshold and raised her lantern. Heavy timbers crossed the ceiling. Dust covered everything, yet the supports looked more substantial than those near the abandoned workings visible from the entrance. Thomas examined one post carefully. This was reinforced. Hard to say, but somebody put effort into supporting a chamber that doesn't look like it was producing much ore. Eliza checked Daniel's notebook. The symbol beside the chamber matched one of the marks followed by winter. Thomas noticed. Could mean winter repairs. Maybe. Or conditions he only checked in winter. Maybe. Eliza disliked how little the word answered. They continued only where Daniel's marks indicated safer passage. The next section remained surprisingly dry. A shallow drainage groove followed the wall, much like the one in Eliza's chamber. Beyond it they found a recessed space cut into the rock. Wooden shelving lined one side. Iron hooks had been fixed overhead, and fragments of old crates lay against the back wall. Thomas lifted one carefully. The wood crumbled at the edge. Storage. Eliza moved the lantern across the shelves. Miners stored supplies underground. They did. Thomas pointed toward the floor. But this isn't near a working face, and there's no sign they were keeping ore here. Tools possible. He looked at the number of shelves. A lot of tools. Eliza found another of Daniel's symbols cut beside the entrance. Safe. Beneath it was a second mark she did not recognize. She copied it into the margin of the notebook rather than guessing. Daniel's voice seemed almost audible in her memory. "Never guess underground." Thomas watched her. "You really listened to him? When it involved rock over my head? Most children don't." Most children didn't have Daniel Ward explaining 12 different ways a mountain could kill them. Thomas laughed softly. Eliza surprised herself by smiling. Until then, she had regarded his presence as an intrusion she was tolerating. Now, as he tested another timber before allowing her beneath it, she realized he was not treating her like the foolish girl who had moved into a mine. He was taking both her knowledge and Daniel's marks seriously. At the far side of the storage alcove, they found a narrow passage. Daniel's warning symbol had been carved clearly into the stone. Thomas did not even approach it. "That's our boundary," Eliza nodded. The decision came easily. Whatever Blackstone concealed. Neither curiosity nor pride justified ignoring the one person who had known its dangers. They returned to the reinforced chamber and sat on an old timber while Eliza examined the notebook again. She found 3 separate entries containing the winter notation. One corresponded to her entrance chamber. Another appeared to match the reinforced room where they sat. A third used the same unknown symbol she had copied from the storage alcove. Maybe he was inspecting these places before cold weather, Thomas suggested. Then why only these chambers? Eliza asked. There are pages about deeper workings, but he doesn't mark them this way. Thomas took the notebook when she offered it. Your father stopped working here after his injury, didn't he? Regular mining work, yes. But some of these dates are later. I noticed. That was what troubled her most. Daniel had continued recording the condition of Blackstone's upper sections when the mine was already losing its commercial purpose. He had checked drainage, ventilation, reinforcement, places that seemed more useful for holding people or supplies than extracting silver. A gust of colder air reached them from the direction of the entrance. Thomas looked back. Weather's changing. When they emerged, snow had begun falling across the mountain. It came lightly at first, small flakes disappearing against dark earth, but the clouds above Silver Hollow were thick and low. Eliza pulled her coat tighter. Thomas glanced toward town. You have enough wood tonight? Enough. That's not what I asked. It's the answer you're getting. He shook his head, but there was amusement rather than irritation in it. Before leaving, he looked back at Blackstone. I still don't like you living here. You've mentioned that, but I was wrong about one thing. Your father didn't mark these chambers casually. Eliza returned inside as the snow strengthened. She sat beside the stove with Daniel's notebook, turning pages slowly. Near the back, 2 sheets had stuck together with age. She separated them carefully and found a short entry she had missed. It contained the familiar safe symbol, followed by a reference to the upper chambers. Beneath it, Daniel had written 2 words in his cramped hand. Eliza leaned closer to the lantern. Upper Refuge. The snow that began outside Blackstone did not stop overnight. By morning, Silver Hollow had disappeared beneath a white layer deep enough to soften the roads and bury the lower steps of several buildings. Eliza stood at the mine entrance with a cup of weak coffee warming her hands and watched men shovel paths between the boarding house, general store, and stable. The storm was not yet unusual for the mountains, but it was early enough in the season to make everyone notice by noon. Word reached her that the main wagon road had been blocked by drifting snow several miles below town. Amos Pike treated the news as an inconvenience rather than a warning. When Eliza entered his store to buy flour and lamp oil, he was telling 2 customers that the road would be open again as soon as a crew cleared the worst drift. "Couple days at most," he said. Then he noticed Eliza. "How's life underground?" one customer smiled. Eliza placed her coins on the counter. "Dry." "That's something." Amos measured flour into a paper sack. "Still, if this keeps up, we may have to start charging you miners for sunlight." Eliza ignored him. She noticed instead that several shelves behind him were less full than they had been a week earlier. Expecting another supply wagon, she asked. Amos glanced toward the window. "As soon as the road clears." "And if it doesn't?" "It will." His confidence sounded more habitual than certain. Eliza carried her purchases back to Blackstone through deepening snow. The difference in temperature struck her immediately. Outside, the wind cut through her coat. Inside the first chamber, the air remained cool but steady. The rock did not become warm, yet it held less of the bitter night cold than the wooden buildings in town. Her stove required less fuel than she had expected to keep the chamber tolerable. For the first time, living in Blackstone felt less like endurance and more like a practical advantage she had stumbled into. That did not stop the jokes. 2 boys passed the mine entrance that afternoon and shouted, "Good evening, cave girl," before running away, laughing. Eliza almost shouted after them, then decided the mountain was large enough to absorb childish stupidity without her help. Thomas arrived shortly before sunset, carrying a length of stovepipe and a small tool bag. I heard your stove drawing badly yesterday. It wasn't bad, Ben said, smoke backed into the chamber. Eliza frowned. Ben talks too much. Fortunately, Thomas inspected the pipe, adjusted its angle, and secured a loose joint near the entrance. If you're determined to live here, at least don't poison yourself doing it. You make concern sound insulting. You make accepting help difficult. Maybe I'm consistent. He smiled briefly and returned to the stove. While he worked, Eliza showed him Daniel's notebook and the words Upper Refuge. Thomas read the entry twice. Refuge from what? That's what I want to know. Could be mining language. Then why mark storage shelves, drainage, and reinforced chambers? Thomas had no answer. Before leaving, he tested the draft by holding a scrap of paper near the stovepipe opening. Air pulled steadily. There's good movement through here, he said. Better than I'd expect in a sealed, dead-end chamber. There's an old ventilation opening in the wall. Show me. Eliza led him to it. Thomas held the lantern near the narrow-framed opening and watched the flame lean slightly toward the passage. Still drawing. After all these years, that means air is moving somewhere. The next morning, Dr. Nathan Cole appeared at Blackstone, carrying his medical bag, despite Eliza insisting she was not sick. Margaret told me you were sleeping in here, he said. Silver Hollow has apparently decided my housing arrangements are public business. Only because people enjoy talking more than working. Dr. Cole examined the chamber with professional suspicion. He checked the stove, ventilation opening, dampness, and the condition of the floor. I don't recommend abandoned mines as homes, he said finally. I'm noticing a pattern, but this chamber is dry, and the temperature is steadier than I expected. Keep the ventilation clear. If you smell smoke or become dizzy, get outside immediately. So you're saying it isn't madness? I'm saying madness would be assuming any underground room is safe forever. He glanced at Daniel's reinforced timbers. This one has been prepared better than most. After he left, Eliza returned to the notebook. Daniel had drawn several rough diagrams among pages she had skimmed before because they looked like mind sketches. One caught her attention now. 2 arrows pointed through the upper workings, one near the entrance and another farther into the mountainside. She showed it to Thomas when he returned later that day. He compared the drawing to the ventilation opening. This arrow could be here, and the other, maybe another shaft. I don't remember one. Could be covered, collapsed, or outside where nobody notices it. The road remained closed. Snow continued falling in bursts, and Amos began limiting how much flour and lamp oil customers bought at once. Silver Hollow still treated the situation as temporary. Men joked while shoveling roofs. Children played in drifts, yet each evening the temperature dropped lower. Eliza sat inside Blackstone listening to wind scrape across the entrance while the chamber around her remained strangely stable. She opened Daniel's diagram again and traced the second arrow with her finger. Thomas had been quiet when he studied it, but she had seen the change in his expression. If the first mark represented the ventilation opening inside Blackstone, then the second had to lead somewhere beyond the chamber. Daniel had drawn another point where air could enter or escape, and whatever that second opening was, neither Eliza nor anyone in Silver Hollow seemed to remember where it was. The next storm arrived before Silver Hollow had cleared the road from the first one. By afternoon, the sky had darkened, the wind had risen, and snow was moving sideways across town, hard enough to erase footprints within minutes. Eliza watched from Blackstone's entrance as men struggled to secure shutters and roofs. The cold sharpened after sunset. Inside the mine, the temperature held steadier than it did in town, but the sound of the wind made the entrance feel smaller. Near midnight, Eliza heard pounding outside and stepped into the snow with her lantern. Ben Carter stood there breathless, his coat white with powder. Margaret's boarding house roof gave way over the back rooms, he said. Not all of it. Enough. Eliza's first thought was Margaret. Anyone hurt? No. Dr. Cole checked them, but they're crowding everyone into the front rooms. Ben rubbed his hands together. Thomas is helping brace what he can. By morning, the storm had worsened. The wagon road was no longer merely blocked. Nobody could say when it would reopen. Amos had begun rationing flour, lamp oil, and several other supplies. Firewood was becoming difficult to move through the drifts. Eliza went into town after the wind eased slightly and found Silver Hollow changed. There was no joking now. Men cleared snow from roofs in shifts. Margaret's boarding house leaned under fresh accumulation, one section covered with canvas where shingles and boards had failed. Inside, families occupied rooms meant for half their number. Cole moved between them, checking an elderly man and two children shivering beneath blankets. Thomas came down from the damaged section with snow in his hair. "You're all right," he asked Eliza. "Blackstone's holding." "Better than this place," Margaret overheard him. Her face was drawn with exhaustion. "I can keep everyone here for now, but if that roof goes again, I don't know where I'll put them." Dr. Cole looked at Eliza. "How steady is the temperature in your chamber?" She knew immediately what he was thinking. "Steadier than here." "Dry?" "Yes." "Ventilation still drawing?" "Yes." Thomas met her eyes but said nothing. Eliza felt resentment rise before anyone asked the question aloud. These were the same people who had watched her drag everything she owned out of town. Some had laughed. Amos had turned her desperation into a joke. Now the place that had made her ridiculous looked useful. Dr. Cole spoke carefully. "For vulnerable people, even temporary shelter underground might be safer than exposed rooms if another roof fails." "It's my home," Eliza said. Margaret's expression tightened with shame. "He's not saying otherwise." "No," Eliza said. "But everyone seems to remember Blackstone differently now." Silence followed. Thomas waited until they were outside before speaking. "You're allowed to be angry." Eliza turned on him. "How generous! I'm not telling you what to feel." Snow blew between them. Thomas lowered his voice. "But whatever you decide next belongs to you, not to the people who laughed." Eliza looked back toward the boarding house windows. She could see a child's face near the glass. "They didn't care where I slept. Some didn't. And now I'm supposed to care where they sleep?" Thomas did not answer immediately. "No. You decide what kind of person you want to be without letting them decide it for you." She hated that the words landed where they did. By late afternoon, part of another roof near the center of town had begun to sag under the weight of snow. Dr. Cole returned to Blackstone with Margaret and 3 residents from the boarding house, an elderly widow and a mother with 2 small children. They stood at the entrance uncertainly, as though the place they had mocked from a distance had become something they did not know how to enter. Eliza looked at them, then at Daniel's safe mark carved into the chamber wall. "Only this chamber," she said. "Nobody goes past the markings without me." Margaret nodded. "Understood." Eliza stepped aside. The widow entered first, followed by the mother and children. Margaret carried blankets. Dr. Cole inspected the stove and ventilation again. Within an hour, the entrance chamber held bedrolls, coats, food bundles, and quiet voices. Eliza's small home had become crowded, but the children stopped shivering. That mattered more than she wanted it to. As darkness fell, Thomas arrived with news that another family had lost a safe sleeping room. Then Ben appeared with 2 more people behind him. Eliza counted the available floor space and felt her stomach tighten. The entrance chamber was nearly full. Dr. Cole came to stand beside her. "Can any of the upper rooms be used?" Eliza looked into the darkness beyond the chamber, toward Daniel's symbols and the reinforced passages she and Thomas had inspected. She knew there were other spaces. She also knew some were marked safe and others very clearly were not. Outside, more voices approached through the storm. Someone knocked against the timber at the entrance and called her name. Eliza opened Daniel's notebook and stared at the symbols beside the word winter. For the first time, the question was no longer why her father had marked those rooms. It was whether she could trust those markings enough to put other people's lives beneath the mountain. Eliza did not let anyone move beyond the entrance chamber until Thomas had checked the next room again. He went first with a lantern, testing the reinforced timbers and studying the ceiling while Eliza followed with Daniel's notebook open in her hands. The same safe symbol appeared beside the passage, and the winter notation matched the reinforced chamber they had already explored. "This one can hold people," Thomas said. "Not too many," Eliza nodded. Dr. Cole moved the elderly widow and the mother with 2 children there first, placing them away from the colder entrance. Margaret began arranging blankets along the walls and assigning sleeping spaces before anyone could argue. Within an hour, Blackstone sounded less like an abandoned mine and more like an overcrowded boarding house. Amos Pike arrived carrying sacks of flour, dried beans, coffee, and lamp oil from the general store. He looked uncomfortable when he saw Eliza. "Thought these might be useful." "They are. I'm not charging anybody while we're in here." Eliza raised an eyebrow. Amos cleared his throat. "No point keeping food on shelves if roofs come down on the customers." It was not an apology, but Eliza accepted the supplies. Ben carried smaller bundles between chambers and helped Margaret keep the entrance clear. Dr. Cole claimed one corner for anyone suffering from exposure or illness. Thomas reinforced a loose brace near the passage with salvaged lumber. Without discussion, each person found useful work. The prom regardless residents arrived as the storm continued damaging buildings and the safe upper chambers filled quickly. Eliza consulted Daniel's notebook repeatedly. Some passages bore his warning marks, and she refused even to consider them. Others carried the safe symbol beside the strange winter notation. Thomas checked each before anyone entered. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every chamber Daniel marked with winter had heavier reinforcement, better drainage, or both. He wasn't just recording weather, Eliza said. Thomas examined the notebook. No. He was identifying rooms meant to hold people. The answer sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Daniel had not simply remembered Blackstone. He had maintained a map of refuge spaces before Eliza could follow the thought further. A man from one of the damaged houses pointed toward a deeper passage. "There's plenty of room down there." "No," Eliza said. "It's marked unsafe. We can't keep squeezing families into these chambers while half the mountain sits empty." "The mountain isn't empty. It's unstable." The man frowned. "You don't own Blackstone." "I didn't say I did." "Then why do you get to decide?" Several people turned toward them. Eliza felt heat rise in her face. Only days earlier they had mocked her for living here. Now someone was accusing her of controlling a place nobody had wanted. "Because my father marked that passage dangerous," she said, "and because Thomas checked the supports." "Nobody goes deeper. Your father's been dead for years." Thomas stepped between them without raising his voice. "Rock lasts longer than arguments. If Daniel marked it unsafe and I haven't inspected it, we don't use it." Dr. Cole added, "Crowding is unpleasant. A collapse is worse." The man muttered but backed away. Eliza's hands were trembling when she closed the notebook. Thomas noticed. "You were right." "I know. That doesn't make it easy." She looked at the crowded chamber. "If I'm wrong once, someone gets hurt, then don't guess." Daniel's old rule, Eliza steadied herself. We use only what he marked. The system held through the afternoon. Margaret rationed blankets, Amos portioned food, Ben carried water and messages, Drive Cole checked coughing children, and a man whose fingers had gone numb in the cold. The mind remained cramped and dim, but the reinforced chambers stayed dry and noticeably warmer than the storm outside. Near evening, Ben called from the old storage alcove. "Eliza, there's something back here." She and Thomas joined him. Ben had moved a broken section of shelving to make room for supplies. Behind it, faint lettering showed on the rock wall, almost hidden beneath dust. Eliza wiped the surface carefully with her sleeve. Several words emerged, scratched by a hand older than Daniel's markings. Most were too faded to read, but one line remained clear enough. Thomas leaned close to the lantern. "Can you make that out?" Eliza read it slowly. After the winter of '63. Below it were fragments, families, upper rooms, provisions, storm. Eliza looked toward the reinforced chambers now filled with Silver Hollow residents. Daniel's winter symbols suddenly made sense in a way she had not expected. "These rooms weren't prepared for miners," she said. Thomas stared at the writing. Then who were they prepared for? Eliza brushed away more dust. Beneath the sentence was another faded line, and this time the words were unmistakable. "For the town," Eliza read the faded words again while Thomas held the lantern closer. "For the town." Behind them, voices drifted from the reinforced chambers where families were settling beneath blankets. The coincidence felt almost too precise. Blackstone was sheltering Silver Hollow again, yet nobody in town had remembered that it had done so before. Ben crouched beside the dismantled shelving. There's something underneath. A warped board lay partly buried beneath dust and fragments of old crates. Thomas lifted it, revealing a shallow recess in the stone. Inside were several folded papers wrapped in deteriorated cloth. Eliza touched them carefully. The outer sheets had suffered from age, but the dry alcove had protected enough writing to remain legible. They carried dates from decades earlier, long before Daniel's later notebook entries. One account described a winter storm that had closed the road and damaged homes in Silver Hollow. Families had been brought into Blackstone's upper workings, while miners kept fires controlled near ventilated areas and distributed provisions stored underground. Another page listed repairs made afterward: reinforcement of upper chambers, clearing of drainage channels, improvements to airflow, and maintenance of spaces for emergency stores. Thomas looked around the alcove. The shelves, Eliza nodded. They weren't just for mining supplies. The papers did not describe Blackstone as a permanent shelter. They described a place prepared for emergencies because the mountain protected it from the worst wind and cold. After the earlier disaster, the miners had decided not to trust luck the next time winter trapped the settlement. Eliza turned to Daniel's notebook. His later markings followed the same chambers named in the older records. He kept checking them, she said. Even after the mine stopped being worth much, Thomas studied one of Daniel's dates. Drainage, supports, ventilation. He wasn't refusing to let go of his old job. The realization hurt more than Eliza expected. She remembered Daniel older and injured, still talking about Blackstone while neighbors politely stopped listening. She had sometimes stopped listening too, when he said the mine should never be sealed. She had heard an aging miner protecting a memory. Now she understood that he had been protecting knowledge. Outside, wind pressed snow against the entrance. Eliza could hear Margaret directing someone to move a blanket away from the stove, and Amos arguing quietly about food portions. The people sheltered here had forgotten what Blackstone was. Daniel had not. There's another reference, Thomas said. He pointed to a damaged page. Eliza moved the lantern closer. The writing described an emergency route from the upper chambers to a secondary opening farther along the mountainside. "Another exit," she said. "That could be the second point on Daniel's airflow diagram." Thomas nodded. "If it still exists." The page was torn where a more exact description might have been. Another record mentioned the secondary opening but gave no useful location. Eliza searched Daniel's notebook and found the two-arrow sketch again. One corresponded with the ventilation opening they knew. The other pointed beyond the upper chambers. But there was no distance or clear direction. "He knew where it was," she said. "Remember, he expected himself to remember." "Your father had a talent for leaving half an answer." Eliza almost laughed. Instead, her eyes burned. "He thought people remembered all this?" Thomas looked toward the papers. "Maybe when he was younger they did. That possibility made the loss feel larger. A whole community could forget something without deciding to. Miners left, children grew up, buildings changed owners, stories became shorter until the important part disappeared." Thomas touched her shoulder lightly. "Daniel kept enough of it alive for you to find." Eliza looked down at the notebook. "After everyone stopped caring what he knew, you care." She swallowed. "A little late. Still counts." For several moments they stood without speaking. Then a cough echoed from the main chamber, reminding Eliza that grief had to wait. She gathered the old papers and carried them to Dr. Cole. Margaret and Amos. They read enough to understand what Blackstone's upper rooms had been designed to do. Amos looked genuinely shaken. "My father never mentioned any of this." "Neither did most people's fathers," Eliza said. "That's how it disappeared." That evening they adjusted the shelter using the old information. Supplies remained in the dry alcove. Nobody entered passages outside Daniel's safe markings. Thomas inspected the reinforced areas again. The secondary exit remained an unanswered problem, but searching blindly during a storm would be more dangerous than staying put. Hours later, Eliza was checking the stove when smoke curled back into the chamber instead of drawing cleanly outward. She opened the damper. The smoke hesitated again. Dr. Cole noticed immediately. That wasn't happening before. Eliza crossed to the old ventilation opening and held her hand near it. The current of air was weaker. Thomas joined her with the lantern. Its flame barely leaned. "Snow," he said. "Could be covering something outside." Eliza looked toward the crowded chambers. If their primary airflow became blocked, the refuge could turn dangerous despite its reinforced stone. She opened Daniel's notebook to the diagram with two arrows. One route was failing. Somewhere beyond the upper workings was another opening built into Blackstone for exactly this kind of emergency. The old records proved it existed, but nobody alive in Silver Hollow seemed to know where it came out. Eliza extinguished one of the lamps and told Margaret to reduce the stove fire. Until they restored the airflow, there was no reason to consume more oxygen than necessary. Nobody panicked, but the change traveled through Blackstone quickly. Conversations quieted. Parents pulled children closer. Thomas studied Daniel's diagram beside the weak ventilation opening. "We know the second opening connects to the upper workings," he said. "We don't know where, then we follow only passages Father marked safe." Eliza turned pages until she found the symbols corresponding to the refuge chambers. One mark beyond the storage alcove had puzzled her before because it did not indicate either safety or danger. Now, comparing it with the two-arrow airflow sketch, she saw the same mark beside the second arrow. "Here." Thomas leaned closer. "Could mean ventilation or exit. Either would help." They took lanterns and rope, leaving Dr. Cole in charge of monitoring the air and stove. Ben wanted to come, but Eliza refused. "Stay with Margaret. If we don't return quickly, nobody follows us." She and Thomas moved through the reinforced chambers. past families who watched without asking questions. Beyond the storage alcove, they followed a narrow upper passage Daniel had marked safe. The air grew colder as they advanced. Thomas tested supports before each turn. Eliza kept one hand on the notebook and resisted the temptation to hurry. Daniel's rule mattered more now than ever. Never guess underground. After several minutes, Thomas stopped. "Feel that." A faint current touched Eliza's face, cold air. They followed it to a section where the passage rose sharply and ended beneath a slope of packed debris. Thomas held the lantern low. Not a collapse. Eliza examined the material. Soil, branches, loose stones, and snow had pushed inward from above. "We're near the surface." They began clearing cautiously. Thomas loosened stones while Eliza pulled away branches and frozen earth. The work was slow because neither wanted to disturb the surrounding rock. Eventually, a narrow crack appeared. A blade of freezing air entered with enough force to make the lantern flame jump. Eliza laughed from pure relief. "There!" Thomas widened the gap until pale daylight showed through. Snow had buried the outside opening almost completely. They cleared only enough to establish strong airflow and a passage a person could crawl through if necessary. Thomas looked out first. "We're farther along the mountainside, above the worst drifting near the main entrance." Eliza stared through the opening at white slopes and gray sky. Daniel's second arrow had not been a meaningless mining note. It marked another way out. When they returned to the refuge chambers, the difference was already noticeable. Smoke drew properly again. Dr. Cole held a lamp near the ventilation opening and watched the flame lean with renewed current. "Better," he said. The tension in the room loosened. Margaret exhaled and immediately ordered someone to put another pot of water on the stove. Amos muttered, "Never thought I'd be grateful for a hole in a mountain." "2 holes," Eliza said. Apparently, Father considered that important. Over the next hours, Thomas and 2 others kept the secondary opening clear, while the main entrance accumulated drifting snow. The new route was not comfortable, but it allowed limited movement when crossing the main approach became difficult. More importantly, fresh air continued circulating through the upper chambers. Eliza finally understood Daniel's warning in full. If Blackstone had been sealed after abandonment, the entrance might have been blocked permanently. The ventilation route could have been lost. The secondary exit could have disappeared beneath the mountainside. The refuge would have become nothing more than inaccessible stone rooms. That evening, Eliza sat alone for a few minutes near the storage alcove, with Daniel's notebook in her lap. She traced his handwriting with one finger. "You could have explained it better," she whispered. The complaint broke something inside her. She lowered her head and cried quietly. Not because Daniel had failed her, but because she finally understood how long he had carried knowledge nobody else valued. He had maintained drainage channels and checked supports after the silver stopped mattering. He had preserved the markings because someday people might need them. Now they did, and he was not here to see it. Thomas found her, but did not speak until she wiped her face. "He would recognize what you're doing," he said. "You can't know that." "No, but I know what he prepared, and I know who's keeping people out of the passages he marked dangerous." Eliza closed the notebook. "Everyone forgot him." Not everyone. She looked toward the chambers filled with Silver Hollow families. "They forgot what he knew." "Then you're making them remember." The words stayed with her as they returned to the entrance chamber. Outside, the wind had eased enough for a few people to check nearby buildings, though the road remained buried and the cold severe. For several hours, Blackstone settled into an uneasy routine. Food was rationed, children slept, Dr. Cole checked the sick. Thomas monitored the supports and exits. Eliza checked Daniel's markings until she could almost see the refuge through his eyes. Near midnight, Ben came from the entrance, his expression tense. "You should see the sky." Eliza stepped outside with Thomas. Clouds had swallowed the stars, darker and heavier than before. Wind was rising from the mountains, carrying the first hard grains of new snow. Thomas looked toward Silver Hollow, where damaged roofs stood beneath accumulating drifts. "This one's coming fast." Eliza tightened her coat and looked back at Blackstone's open entrance. Much of the town already depended on the refuge. Then the wind struck harder, and the next storm began. By dawn, the storm had erased Silver Hollow beyond the mouth of Blackstone. Snow drove across the entrance so thickly that Eliza could barely see the nearest buildings. Thomas and 2 other men took turns clearing the approach, while another group kept the secondary opening free enough for ventilation. Inside, every safe upper chamber was occupied. Families slept shoulder to shoulder. Children cried from exhaustion. The stove fires were kept low. Food was rationed, and Dr. Cole moved constantly between people suffering from cold and exposure. Shortly after sunrise, Ben stumbled through the entrance, shouting that another building near the boarding house had partially failed. "Everyone got out," he said, struggling for breath. "They're coming here." Eliza looked at Daniel's notebook. They had already filled every chamber marked for winter use. How many? 9? Maybe 10. Thomas came in behind him, his coat crusted with snow. "We can make room in the second chamber if we tighten the sleeping rows." "Not near the loose brace. I'll reinforce it." They worked quickly. Margaret shifted blankets and moved families closer together. Amos carried provisions from the storage alcove to clear additional floor space. Dr. Cole placed the healthiest adults nearest the colder passage and kept children and older residents deeper in the stable chambers. When the displaced group arrived, Eliza counted them before allowing anyone farther inside. One man looked toward a dark, lower passage. "There's room down there." "No," Eliza said. "Those workings are marked unsafe. We're packed in here." "Then we'll be packed." His fear turned sharp. "People could freeze outside while you've got empty rooms." Eliza stepped between him and the passage. "Those aren't rooms. They're abandoned workings my father marked dangerous. And if more people come, we make space where it's safe." Thomas drove a new support into position nearby, the hammer blows echoing through the chamber. "She's right. Nobody goes below." The man looked around for support, but found none. Eliza felt no satisfaction. She understood his fear because she shared it. The difference was that Daniel had left her boundaries, and she would not sacrifice lives to gain a few yards of floor. By afternoon, the storm became worse. Wind packed snow against the main entrance faster than men could clear it. Thomas ordered them to stop making unnecessary trips outside. A ceiling brace near the entrance shifted under the changing pressure around the opening, and he spent nearly an hour strengthening it with lumber, while Eliza held the lantern. "Tell me if that moves," he said. It moved. How much enough that I noticed. Very comforting. Despite herself, she smiled. Even now, he trusted her eyes. That trust steadied her. Elsewhere, Blackstone functioned through dozens of small acts. Margaret organized meals from Amos's supplies. Amos measured portions carefully but refused payment when anyone offered. Ben carried water, blankets, messages, and Daniel's instructions between chambers until Margaret ordered him to sit down and eat. Dr. Cole treated a woman whose hands had gone dangerously cold and monitored 2 coughing children. Eliza moved constantly, checking ventilation, drainage lamps, and every passage leading toward unsafe ground. Nothing about the refuge was comfortable. The air smelled of damp wool, smoke, bodies, and boiled beans. People were frightened. Babies woke others. Tempers shortened. Fuel had to be conserved. Yet the mountain held around them while the storm battered everything outside. Late that night, Eliza stood near the entrance, listening to the wind. Amos joined her carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He offered one. "It's weak. Everything is weak except the weather." He gave a tired laugh, then became serious. "I owe you something." Eliza looked at him. "More coffee?" "An apology." He stared into his cup. "I laughed when you moved up here. Thought living in an abandoned mine was the most foolish thing I'd heard all year. You weren't alone. Doesn't make me less wrong." He glanced toward the crowded chambers. "We'd be in serious trouble tonight if you hadn't known which parts of this place were safe." Eliza looked at Daniel's symbol on the wall. Weeks earlier, she might have wanted the apology badly enough to make Amos feel every word of it. Now she was simply tired. Blackstone was prepared for all of you before either of us understood it. You still knew enough to make us listen. My father knew. I listened late. Amos nodded and returned to the others. Eliza remained near the entrance. She realized she no longer cared whether the town remembered who had laughed first. Their fear, work, and survival had become shared inside the mountain. Sometime before morning, the wind changed. At first, Eliza thought exhaustion was fooling her. Then Thomas came from the entrance and stood listening beside her. The roaring had weakened. Snow still fell, but not with the same violence. "It's easing," he said. People began waking as the news passed quietly through the chambers. Nobody celebrated yet. The main entrance was buried beyond the cleared passage, and no one knew what the storm had done to the buildings outside. Thomas and Eliza worked with 2 others until a narrow path opened through the drift. Pale morning light entered Blackstone. Eliza stepped to the threshold. Beyond it, Silver Hollow lay beneath deep snow, shapes of roofs barely visible through the lingering white. Some were standing. Others looked wrong from where she stood. She could not tell how much of the town remained intact. The storm had finally weakened. Now they had to discover what it had left behind. Eliza was among the first to step beyond Blackstone after the storm. Snow reached above her knees where the path had not been cleared, and Silver Hollow looked smaller beneath it. Several roofs sagged. One shed had disappeared completely. The damaged section of Margaret's boarding house had collapsed farther, but the main structure still stood. Smoke eventually appeared from 2 chimneys, thin against the pale morning sky. "Town's still here," Thomas said beside her. "Most of it. That's enough to start with." There was no sudden return to normal. The wagon road remained buried, food stayed rationed, and damaged buildings could not be repaired in a day. But the people emerging from Blackstone no longer waited for someone else to solve each problem. Thomas organized crews to brace roofs and clear paths. Margaret turned the usable rooms of her boarding house into a place for meals and temporary bedding. Amos counted what remained in his store and continued distributing necessities carefully. Dr. Cole checked everyone who had suffered exposure. Ben carried messages between crews until Eliza threatened to make him sit beside the stove if he did not slow down. She spent much of that first day moving between Blackstone and town. The refuge remained open for anyone whose home was unsafe. She checked Daniel's markings, drainage, and ventilation repeatedly, no longer because the mine belonged to her desperation, but because other lives now depended on what her father had preserved. In the days that followed, Eliza and Thomas returned to the old papers found behind the storage shelves. With the immediate danger reduced, they could read them more carefully. The scattered records finally formed a complete history decades earlier, after a deadly winter trapped Silver Hollow and forced families into Blackstone. Miners had deliberately prepared the stable upper workings for future emergencies. They reinforced chambers that could safely hold people. They improved drainage to keep the floors dry. They maintained airflow through separate openings. They established storage space for provisions and preserved a secondary route out of the mountain. The dangerous lower workings were never part of the refuge. Daniel had later helped maintain the safe sections even as commercial mining faded. His notebook continued the work the earlier miners had begun. Eliza sat beside the storage shelves with the papers spread before her and remembered the sentence he had repeated near the end of his life. Never let them seal Blackstone completely. She had believed he was mourning the mine. Silver Hollow had apparently believed Blackstone was nothing more than exhausted rock. Both had been wrong. Daniel feared that sealing the abandoned mine would destroy the town's forgotten shelter by closing access, ventilation, and the emergency exit. He knew exactly what could be lost. Eliza said. Thomas sat opposite her, and he kept trying to preserve it, without explaining half of it. That sounds like Daniel, from everything you've told me, she laughed quietly, then wiped at her eyes. I thought nobody cared what he knew. Maybe they didn't know enough to care. Eliza looked toward the safe symbol carved into the wall. That's almost worse. Maybe. But they know now. Apologies came awkwardly over the following weeks. Amos repeated his without excuses. Others who had laughed at the mine girl avoided Eliza's eyes before eventually finding reasons to thank her. Margaret was more direct. As repairs progressed at the boarding house, she approached Eliza outside Blackstone. When my rooms are usable again, one is yours if you want it. Eliza immediately stiffened. I won't take charity. I didn't offer charity. Margaret folded her arms. You can pay the same rent everyone else pays when you're earning enough. Until then... Blackstone apparently has better accommodations than I do. Eliza smiled. For the moment, I'll stay where I am. Later, when sewing and mending work returned and she could pay for a room herself, she accepted Margaret's offer. Leaving Blackstone felt different from entering it. The first time, she had carried everything she owned while laughter followed her from town. This time, Ben helped with her bundles. Margaret argued about where to put her sewing table, and Thomas carried a wooden box without asking permission. I can carry that, Eliza told him. I know, then why are you carrying it? Because I'm already holding it. She let him. Their friendship changed quietly after that. Thomas never tried to rescue her. And Eliza stopped treating every offered hand as a debt waiting to be collected. Sometimes he walked with her to inspect Blackstone. Sometimes they shared coffee after work. Nothing needed a grand declaration. It was enough that she had begun allowing another person beside her without feeling that she had surrendered ground. As winter weakened, Silver Hollow made a decision that should have been made years earlier. Blackstone's stable upper chambers would be maintained as a community emergency refuge. The ventilation routes and secondary exit would be kept clear. Basic provisions would be stored in the dry alcove. The unsafe lower workings would remain closed and clearly marked. Eliza kept Daniel's notebook, but copies of his safety instructions and the older refuge records were made so the knowledge could never again depend on one person remembering it. By early spring, snow began retreating from the lower slopes. One afternoon, Eliza walked to Blackstone alone. Meltwater ran beside the trail, and sunlight reached ground that had been buried for months. A simple sign now stood near the entrance, identifying the safe upper workings as Silver Hollow's emergency refuge. Eliza rested her hand against the weathered timber. She was still poor by any generous definition. Blackstone had revealed no hidden silver vein. Daniel had left no secret fortune. She still earned her living, one repaired coat, washed garment, and sewing job at a time. Yet poverty no longer felt like proof that she stood outside the community. More importantly, she no longer needed isolation to prove she could survive. People passed along the road below. A family approaching town pointed toward the mine, and one of Silver Hollow's children explained why the entrance had to remain open. Eliza listened without correcting him. Months earlier, she had walked toward this same darkness carrying everything she owned while people laughed behind her. She had entered Blackstone because she had nowhere else to go. In the end, the town had followed her there for the same reason. Daniel Ward had left his daughter no treasure beneath the mountain. He had left markings on stone, careful notes, maintained passages, and a warning she had needed years to understand. Silver Hollow had once measured Blackstone by the silver it could pull from the earth. Winter taught them to measure it differently. Eliza looked into the reinforced entrance chamber, then back toward the town her father had quietly prepared to protect. What he left behind had never made her rich. When Winter trapped Silver Hollow, it proved more valuable than anything Blackstone mine had ever pulled from the earth.